There are royal bloodlines so twisted by centuries of inbreeding, they produced rulers who defied the laws of nature. One of them wasn't just a king, he was a living medical anomaly, a monarch born to rule, yet barely able to speak, walk, or chew his own food. This isn't some dark legend. It's the real tragic story of Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, and perhaps the most deformed monarch in history. But before we descend into this royal nightmare, click like and subscribe to join history's hidden horrors, where the past never rests in peace. He entered the world beneath ceilings, gilded with icons of saints who never answered prayers. His mother, Mariana of Austria, felt dread coil in her belly as soon as the midwives pulled him from her. They placed her newborn son in her trembling arms, and she saw it immediately. The jutting lower jaw so severe, his mouth gaped open tongue spilling over swollen lips. His breath came in wet, ragged gasps. The priests called him a miracle. But when she looked into his unfocused eyes, she saw only doom. Outside, Madrid's bells rang to celebrate the heir who would keep Spain's empire alive. Inside, the women who wiped his mouth whispered that the child was born, cursed. Generations of Habsburg incest had twisted royal blood into a poison that eroded flesh and bone. The famed Habsburg jaw had evolved from a subtle regal protrusion into a grotesque deformity. Charles could not close his mouth to swallow without choking. Saliva pooled in his throat, and phlegm crusted his chin lace yellow. Court painters softened his jawline into somber dignity. But in reality, the child king smelled of rot, sour milk, and infected gums. From infancy, his body betrayed him. He trembled with seizures that left his limbs stiff as carved wood. His eyes rolled upward, white and veined, until his nurse slapped his back to force the demon out. She whispered prayers into his ear as he convulsed, promising angels would come for him if he simply survived another day. As he grew, whispers in the palace corridors thickened like incense smoke. Some blamed witches for cursing him. Others blamed Mariana for marrying her uncle. Physicians blamed God's wrath upon royal arrogance. And so priests began exorcisms before he could even walk. They tied blessed ribbons around his wrists and burned black feathers beneath his crib to force out the devil. But no rite could cleanse what centuries of incest had written into his bones. Charles could not speak clearly. Each word clotted in his mouth tongue, too swollen for human language. His teachers wept with pity and frustration as he tried to pronounce Latin prayers drooling onto his silk bibs. He could not chew without help. Food had to be mashed into soupy pulp. Even then, he often choked, gagging with tears streaking down his sunken cheeks. He was the living omen of Spain's decline, a rotting seed meant to grow into a towering oak of empire, but which sprouted gnarled and dying from birth. Servants who carried him up palace steps felt his bones beneath velvet robes, so light they feared the breeze might snap him in two. His thin neck strained beneath golden chains and medallions of patron saints who never saved him. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. But in truth, he was merely the purest child his dynasty could breed, and that purity became its doom. They dressed him in silks embroidered with black eagles and gilded crosses, but no cloth could disguise the trembling boy within. Charles II spent his earliest years confined to echoing marble chambers where courtiers walked lightly, as though loud steps might shatter his fragile body. He sat propped on cushions beneath towering portraits of ancestors, their dark eyes following him with silent judgment. He could not read their thoughts, but he felt their disdain. Every canvas showed kings with proud jaws and fearless gazes. His own jaw jutted like an open wound, teeth overlapping so grotesquely that the royal dentist refused to touch them for fear of breaking bone. Sometimes alone before dawn, he reached up with thin fingers to touch his twisted chin, feeling its hard lump of inheritance. He tried to force it back into place, pressing until tears filled his eyes. But flesh does not yield to will. Blood remembers what power forced it to become. In the chapel, priests murmured prayers to exorcise demons they believed nested in his skull. They sprinkled holy water that slid down his cheeks like tears. When seizures came, they pressed crucifixes to his forehead until the skin reddened, chanting for Satan to release his grip. But no demon emerged. Only Charles, gasping eyes rolling back as his body stiffened and his limbs jerked like a puppet on cut strings. At meals, he sat at the head of a long table lined with silent servants. Bowls of milk soup steamed before him, the scent sour with goat fat and stale bread. Food was mashed until it became beige slop that slid down his throat without chewing. Still he coughed and choked tears dripping into his bowl as his mother watched in disgusted pity. Sometimes he vomited onto his robes, trembling with shame, as servants rushed to clean his chest and dab his chin with rosewater. They called him Niño de Dolor, the child of pain. Physicians pricked his skin with needles dipped in gold and mercury, believing his blood carried corruption that could be drawn out. Each prick left a bruise the color of rotting plums. Still, his limbs remained limp. His mind clouded his eyes, unfocused. His only companions were paid fool's men with twisted spines and lopsided faces who entertained him with grotesque dances. They taught him to mimic their limps, their drooling smiles, their vacant laughter. He watched them carefully, realizing he belonged among them more than he ever belonged upon a throne. Their deformities were honest. His was hidden beneath jewels and velvet. At night alone in his chamber, he lay awake, listening to rats scuttle across stone floors. Moonlight revealed his small, twisted shadow upon the tapestried walls, the silhouette of a child whose very shape condemned a dynasty. Sometimes he pressed his ear to his own chest to hear his heartbeat rapid and fluttering like a dying bird. He wondered if it would stop before dawn. He wondered if anyone would mourn if it did. And yet each morning priests carried him to the cathedral for mass, raising him high so the congregation could see their living relic of power and suffering. Some crossed themselves in pity. Others turned away in fear. A few whispered that his suffering redeemed Spain's sins. But most saw him for what he was, a boy born, broken, sentenced to reign over a kingdom as cursed as himself. He ruled nothing in those early years. Not his mind, not his tongue, not his trembling limbs, but his existence ruled the hearts of all who saw him, with a dread that deepened each year. For in Charles the Quaker, they saw the prophecy that power refused to heed. When blood is twisted to preserve a throne, the throne will become its grave. At just 4 years old, Charles II became King of Spain. He was too small to wear his own crown, so they forged a lighter coronet lined with lamb's wool to keep it from crushing his skull. During his coronation, priests sprinkled holy water upon his drooling chin, while nobles forced trembling oaths of loyalty from their lips. Outside the streets of Madrid thundered with celebration, unaware their kingdom now rested upon the frail bones of a broken child. They built a throne high enough for him to sit above all others, but his feet dangled like a child's shoes, too big, slipping from limp ankles. His mother, Queen Mariana, ruled as regent in his name. She controlled his chambers, his schedule, his physicians, yet even she recoiled from him in private, fearing his twisted presence was proof of divine wrath. Court physicians, desperate to strengthen their monarch, subjected him to rituals that blurred medicine with torture. Leeches clung to his veins to drain black bile. Heated irons pressed against his chest to drive out imagined chill. He screamed and convulsed, thin body arching off marble beds as his mouth frothed with pain. Priests stood by, chanting prayers to expel the devil. But no demon emerged, only blood saliva and the scent of burning skin. When the treatments ended, his mind remained dim. He wandered palace halls alone, accompanied only by eunuchs and fools who could not betray his humiliations. Once an ambassador from France witnessed him standing in a cold corridor, staring at a gilded mirror. king reached out to touch his reflection, fingertips trembling. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only drool fell upon his robes. The ambassador wept upon returning to Versailles, writing to Louis XIV, "Spain is ruled by a dead child who still breathes." Outside the palace, Spain rotted. Wars drained coffers dry. Plagues emptied villages into mass graves. Ships returned from the Americas with less silver each year, while nobles feasted beneath decaying ceilings. The kingdom's decay mirrored its king's. Ministers spoke of him with reverence in public, but behind chamber doors they spat curses upon the bewitched, and still priests clung to hope that his suffering was sacred. They made him endure exorcism after exorcism, binding blessed relics to his ankles, forcing him to swallow fragments of saints' bones ground to dust. He retched each time, tears burning his cheeks as splinters scratched his throat raw. Once, after vomiting upon the floor during Mass, a priest whispered in disgust, "He cannot even keep God within him." In his moments of lucidity, Charles felt it too, that his life was a punishment neither he nor his kingdom could escape. At night he lay awake on damp sheets, breath rattling with wheezing coughs, listening to the echo of prayers recited endlessly beyond his chamber doors. He knew those prayers were not for him to live, but for him to die swiftly, before his cursed bloodline dragged Spain further into darkness. But each dawn he awoke a new, skeletal chest rising and falling with rattled breaths, eyes flickering open to cold ceilings, painted with saints who never answered. And with each day, his body decayed further, the kingdom decayed alongside him, a throne built upon a rotting foundation. He was king, yet prisoner, crowned yet condemned, alive yet dead in all ways that mattered. And Spain could only watch as the child upon its throne dissolved before their eyes, the embodiment of their empire's decay made flesh. By the time Charles turned 14, whispers of his deformities became frantic political prayers for an heir. Spain's empire teetered on the thin edge of his jawbone. Ministers pressed his mother to arrange a marriage. They reasoned that perhaps divine mercy might heal his flesh through union. But even as they signed treaties for his bride, servants whispered the truth: the boy king could barely walk unaided, let alone create life. At 18, he wed Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess with dark hair and quiet, sorrowful eyes. On their wedding night, she sat upon silk sheets embroidered with Habsburg eagles, while courtiers waited outside the chamber door, ears pressed to wood to catch sounds of consummation. Inside, Charles trembled naked at the bed's edge. His bride undressed silently, tears slipping down her cheeks. When he approached her, his limbs shook so violently he could not lift himself upon the mattress. Servants later carried him back to his chamber, his body limp with exhaustion, his dignity drowned in silence. For months after prayers for fertility echoed through Madrid's cathedral, surgeons and priests alike examined him. They forced poultices of bull's blood and ground antlers upon his loins to awaken the dead seed within. They massaged his groin with warmed olive oil and garlic chanting verses from Genesis. Marie-Louise endured her own humiliations, herbal vaginal fumigations, blessed oils, prayers whispered into her belly as she wept. But the king's seed never quickened. His testicles were shrunken, his penis so deformed it curved upon itself painfully when erect. Each attempt at coupling ended with tears and apologies, whispered in guttural Castilian words slurred by his heavy tongue. He wept in her arms, face buried against her chest, drooling onto her nightgown as she stroked his hair in pity. At court, nobles gossiped with increasing venom. They called him El Rey Eunuco, the eunuch king. Priests blamed witches in France for cursing his loins. Ministers blamed his mother's incestuous marriage to her uncle. Physicians blamed the hand of God. And Charles blamed himself, sitting for hours before the Virgin's statue in the royal chapel, clutching her porcelain feet with trembling hands, begging silently for a miracle he knew would never come. Marie-Louise died at 26 childless. Some claimed grief and wasted hope killed her. Others whispered she died of poison administered by courtiers desperate for a fertile queen. When her coffin was carried from the palace, Charles collapsed in the hallway, his cries echoing down marble walls, mouth open in a soundless scream. He refused food for days, rocking back and forth upon his bed until ulcers bloomed across his back from the damp sheets. Desperation gnawed deeper. Within months, he remarried Maria Anna of Neuburg, a Bavarian princess famed for fertility. But she recoiled upon seeing him naked, holding a handkerchief to her nose to block the sour stench of his decaying gums and ulcerated flesh. Her womb, like Marie-Louise's, remained empty. Each failed coupling became another political funeral. Surgeons grew bolder. They inserted probes of ivory and silver into his urethra to clear blockages, ignoring his screams. They blistered his inner thighs with hot cups to draw blood downward until his flesh peeled away in weeping welts. Each intervention left him weaker fevers burning away what little strength he clung to. The empire watched in dread. Every failed attempt at an heir was another death knell for Spain's dominance. But for Charles, it was more than the death of a kingdom. It was the death of hope itself, the final confirmation that his body was not a vessel of God's will, but a rotting relic of human arrogance. He was the last branch of the Habsburg tree, withered before it could ever bloom. By his late 30s, Charles II became a living corpse upon the throne. His skin turned the gray-yellow of old parchment, stretched thin over bones that jutted like splintered branches beneath wasted flesh. His hair fell out in greasy tufts, clinging to his silk pillows each morning, like shed animal fur. When he tried to rise, servants heard the quiet crackle of stiffened joints, the creak of dying tendons failing to lift his own frame. He could no longer walk unassisted. 2 eunuchs supported his arms as he shuffled down palace corridors, feet dragging across marble tiles in ragged slippers. His tongue swelled so large, it filled his mouth, forcing him to grunt and wheeze instead of speak. Saliva poured constantly from his lips, dripping onto his stained robes until they darkened with sour dampness. The smell of him rotted the air, the stench of infected gums putrefying ulcers and digestive decay rising from within. Physicians noted with dread that he began to hallucinate. At night, he saw dark shapes moving at the edges of his chamber, faceless women in blood-soaked veils. He screamed and cried for priests clutching his crucifix until his knuckles split and bled. Exorcists arrived with bells, incense, and relics of long-dead saints chanting prayers over his twitching body for hours. But the shadows only deepened, curling around his sweat-slicked sheets like living smoke. When fever struck, he babbled nonsense through blistered lips, whispering to ghosts that no one else could see. He spoke to his dead wives, to ancient kings painted upon his walls, to children he never sired, begging them for forgiveness. His eyes turned glassy pupils rolling upward, so only milky whites showed. Servants wept as they bathed his wasted limbs, bones rattling beneath sagging skin like loose branches in a dead tree. In his final weeks, his body could no longer process food. Anything swallowed rotted within him, curdling into poison. His stomach bloated grotesquely taut as a drum, while the rest of his frame shriveled into skeletal thinness. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each inhale a struggle against drowning in his own fluids. They laid him upon sheets of black velvet embroidered with gold crosses. Priests kept vigil day and night, chanting prayers of absolution over a king who had not died, but who no longer lived. His skin grew mottled with purple and yellow bruises, spreading like blooming flowers of decay across his arms and chest. Maggots emerged from ulcers upon his legs, squirming in the folds of his bandages. Servants whispered that hell had already claimed him, that the devil fed upon his flesh before God could take his soul. Sometimes, between ragged breaths, he would open his clouded eyes and weep silently. Tears streaked his sunken cheeks, dripping into the hollows above his collarbones. No words came, only a soft, broken whimper, like a calf before slaughter. The crown lay upon a gilded pillow beside his bed, too heavy to place upon his skull, lest it snap his neck in death. On the last morning, priests gathered for final rites. Candles flickered in drafts of cold November air. His chest rose and fell in a trembling rhythm, each breath rattling like wind through broken shutters. As incense smoke curled above his corpse-gray face, his mouth fell open one final time. A thin, rattled sigh escaped the last whisper of a dying dynasty. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But in truth, his curse was not magic nor witchcraft. His curse was simply the blood that had bred him, blood twisted by greed into a death sentence, carried in every trembling breath until the end. After his final breath rattled into silence, the cold grandeur of the Escorial monastery swallowed him whole. Priests pressed candles into dying flames as surgeons approached his corpse scalpels, glinting in the pale dawn light. This was no act of mercy or respect. It was a final dissection of what power had wrought upon flesh. They stripped his body of velvet and jewels, revealing skin stretched paper-thin over bone. The smell rose at once, the sickly sweet reek of rot old pus and necrotic tissue. The lid surgeon crossed himself before sliding the blade from throat to navel, slicing open the bloated belly that had ballooned in his last months. What emerged was a kingdom's curse made visible. His stomach was filled with black water, as if death had pooled within him long before life ended. His intestines lay twisted like knotted rope, ulcerated and riddled with necrosis. His liver had shriveled to half its size, hardened into something closer to stone than organ. When they opened his chest, his heart lay small and wasted a shriveled walnut behind collapsed lungs that smelled of infection. But it was his head that silenced the chamber. When they lifted his skull cap, dark fluid oozed over the surgeon's gloves. His brain was so atrophied, it barely filled half the cavity, shrunk and rotting at the edges soft as spoiled fruit. The surgeon's assistant gagged at the sight, choking back bile, as priests fanned incense to mask the stench of decayed royalty. "Behold what the purity of kings has wrought," whispered one physician voice, trembling with horror. Outside, nobles gathered in mourning silks. They spoke in solemn tones of his piety, his faith, his suffering as a Christian king. But behind their veils, relief flickered in their eyes. The dynasty had ended. The Bewitched was dead. Now Europe would carve Spain into pieces like vultures at a corpse. In the silent monastery chamber, the surgeon stitched his wasted flesh closed and swaddled him in gold-threaded linens. They bound his jaw shut with white bands, forcing his gaping mouth into an illusion of dignity. They placed the Habsburg crown upon his chest too heavy for his decayed skull to bear, and sealed the coffin. They buried him among marble kings and armored emperors' bones, arranged in gilded crypts beneath the Escorial. But no amount of carved saints or silver candelabra could cleanse the rot he carried to the grave. For in Charles II lay the final harvest of royal arrogance, a lineage twisted until it could breed only suffering. The world remembers him as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But his true curse was not witchcraft, nor demonic possession. His curse was the ambition of power itself, the endless hunger to keep bloodlines pure, to bind crowns to flesh until flesh rotted under their weight. In his decayed body, we see the destiny of all empires that eat their own children to preserve a throne. They breed monsters to guard their power, only to find that power itself is the greatest monster of all. And so he lies beneath cold stone jaw, forced shut in death, as it never closed in life. The final king of Spain's Habsburgs, forever silent, forever broken. A reminder that no crown outlasts the flesh it devours.